Welcome to the Work, Wealth, and Travel podcast. I'm your host, Nicole, and this podcast is your guide to start creating a lifestyle by design. From entrepreneurship, money and finance, tax optimization and residencies, and everything in between, this show highlights the nuances of a true global citizen lifestyle. Let's dive in. Today on the show, I'm speaking to Dexter. Dexter is the founder of Money Abroad, an online education platform that helps high earners design their independent money path. Starting his career in San Francisco, he's lived and worked across both Southeast Asia and Latin America for the past 6 years. He has 10 plus years of experience building products and teams at public companies from Dropbox and scaling startups such as Zendit. His work has been featured in global outlets like Business Insider, CBS, US News and World Reports, and Tech in Asia. He graduated from Dartmouth College, and this conversation really revolves around living and working abroad across different cultures, how you can manage money as a digital nomad and global citizen, and what that looks like for him and his partner personally, along with living in Mexico. Let's dive in.
So I'm Dexter. I'm the founder of Money Abroad, which is a online education platform that helps high performers design their independent money path. I'm also a fractional product leader, and I've worked with companies in Silicon Valley, in Southeast Asia, and Latin America for the past decade. So that's my background. And maybe since we're really focused on being abroad and life while you're a nomad or expat or a remote worker, I'll start with San Francisco. That's where I was last based in the U.S. And I was working in the tech industry there for about 6 years, climbing the career ladder. I had kind of reached a level in my career that I felt pretty happy about. I had worked really hard. I was working at Dropbox at the time, and I was feeling like, okay, my career is kind of headed in the right direction, but at the same time, I also had this feeling that was nagging of maybe there's other things that I wanted to do and aspired to do. One of the dreams, for example, that I really had was working internationally, spending time internationally, which was something that I couldn't do because of a lack of financial security and not as much confidence to pull that off. But in 2019, I finally pulled the trigger. I quit my job, and then I left San Francisco. I traveled across Southeast Asia, Europe, South America, doing a travel sabbatical. I think you did something similar yourself. And that was a transformative experience. I discovered the world is really huge, and I made more decisions that aligned with my personal values of curiosity and freedom in pursuing this dream of working internationally. Starting with some travel, but then later deciding, okay, I actually want to be based internationally. So in 2020, I moved to Singapore, where I joined a fintech startup that later became a unicorn in the region and helped them scale their business and also built a product team there. And what I learned from that experience were a lot of things around working in emerging markets and, how do you work in an international kind of context, in a multicultural kind of context. It was a lot of fun and also a lot of challenges, a lot of learnings from that. Along this journey, I also discovered that money is really complicated when you move abroad. Also, when you're kind of at this stage of your career. For me, I'm 33 now, and looking back at the past few years, I discovered that, okay, it was nice for a while for me to continue climbing the career ladder and then aim for bigger and bigger numbers, but that wasn't making me fulfilled necessarily in terms of what I really wanted to do or, what I wanted to spend my money on. So while I was working in Singapore, I was also doing some soul searching around what does money mean to me? How do I, plan my finances, especially since I got married last year as well. So how do I plan finances with my partner for the future while, pursuing our goals around, living abroad, working in different kind of contexts. So that's what led me to start Money Abroad as a content newsletter first and later turning it into this online education kind of business.
You really have the perspective of being an entrepreneur globally, but also working abroad and working in other companies globally. I think that's very interesting, where most nomads and global citizens have a perspective of one or the other, not really both. But it sounds like you are doing both every day, really, in terms of money abroad and being a fractional product leader. So let's start with talking about money, of course, and money abroad. And so you kind of mentioned where that stemmed from. What are some of the challenges and problems that you really see, maybe yourself had, and maybe it stemmed from problems that you had, but that you see a lot of global citizens, digital nomads having when it comes to their finances?
Totally. I think about, when I left San Francisco, I did this travel sabbatical, which obviously was a time of self-discovery and spending money instead of earning a lot of money. And then when I moved to Singapore afterwards, I had to learn about how do you job search in an entirely different market, and how do you, reshape your own expectations for how do you navigate things like salary compensation in the new market. And at the same time, I was still doing some part-time career coaching. That was something that I had discovered and started to do while on this sabbatical, which was really great because that was kind of one of the side hustles that started my journey of realizing, okay, maybe starting businesses and entrepreneurship is also a great path, to increase earnings or diversify your income and take a bit more control of your time. So that was my journey. I think my challenge as I worked internationally, discovering that, as I mentioned, the complexities around moving to a new market and then navigating things like salary compensation in those markets can be tricky as a international kind of job searcher. And two is, once you're there, you're exposed to a lot more challenges around spending or, taxes or, the complexities that I'm sure, you've talked about with previous podcast guests. I think that's a key point that expats, remote workers, digital nomads really face. And then third is also more psychological, but it's thinking about, okay, what is my relationship with money like when I'm abroad? What am I really abroad for? What's the reason why I'm deciding to work internationally? Is it to get rich, or is it to pursue certain life experiences that I'm going to look on in decades and cherish fondly and celebrate with my partner? So I also think that that's a big challenge for. I've talked to other expats, nomads, and they struggle with that as well, that relationship to money piece.
It's interesting as you're saying that. So I lived in China for about 4 years, and I haven't thought about this in a long time, but I'm remembering now that the concept for me personally, and I talked to a lot of friends when I was living there, and they ironically had a similar perception of money, where the money there, I mean, of course it was all digital, but we're also always using credit cards in the West as well. But I would see something that's like 100 RMB, so like 100 Chinese yuan, and I would be like, oh, that's nothing. And then it would equate to around 20 Canadian dollars back where I am from, and I would never spend that on the item that I'm looking to buy. But then when it's in another currency, it's like, oh, it's so affordable, just get it. And like I found money was going so much faster, and so I really had to refocus what I was spending my money on, because it was so easy to just like spend. Maybe that had something with everything being just scanning a QR code, and this was years back. But yeah, it's interesting. I think when you go abroad, I'm curious, did you have any experiences around money like that?
Definitely, for sure. Well, first of all, in China, I think it's really amazing. My parents are from Shanghai, so I go and visit Shanghai every once in a while, and just seeing the transformation of payments and how easy payments has become in China is remarkable. And I can totally imagine, moving there for the first time, especially like a decade ago or something, and just being able to spend really easily because payments had made that so much more accessible. For me, when I moved to Singapore, I realized that, okay, not every country or not every major city that you move to internationally is going to be necessarily more affordable. There's certainly amazing international cities that are more affordable that you can, move to as a remote worker or as an expat. And I've done that as well, and that works out great. But certain places like Singapore, which are really cosmopolitan kind of global hubs, they become a really more expensive place for expats to live. And for my wife and I, we fortunately moved there like in the middle of COVID, so there wasn't too many expenses that we needed to spend on during COVID. But then after COVID, I think our major form of spending, especially on like a personal side, was just traveling around the region, spending time, taking advantage of being in Southeast Asia. And we look back on that and we're really happy that we spent that money on all those experiences, because those are highlights that we'll be able to look back on. We'll have photos, we'll be able to cherish those memories. But I think people who live in Singapore don't realize like how much they're going to be traveling, how much they're going to be leveraging, the unique opportunity. And then the mindset is also like, well, I'm going to be here for just like a couple of years. Might as well just, do everything possible, right?
I think a lot of people, before they move abroad, you think that you're going to have the same mindset around money as you do in your home country or in the country where you currently are. But especially when you're moving to a completely different culture, different continent, especially somewhere that you've never been before, it's really interesting and surprising sometimes to see how over time, over months and over years, your perspectives can really change. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. I could go off on, what I find really interesting, just as kind of like a side note around money and language, is how different languages perceive money differently. I know there's a TED Talk, and I've been trying to find it for so long. I watched it so many years ago, and I just can't find it anymore. But there's a really interesting TED Talk on how the Chinese mentality of saving money is different than the Western mentality of saving money, because of it's something to do with like the tenses that we use in Western culture. We say like, I will save, whereas in China, it's like you don't really have tenses so much. I don't know if you know anything about that or if you've heard of that, but like it's just very interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. I'm also fascinated by how language influences the way we view certain things. I haven't thought about it in the context of the money terms, so that's really interesting. But you're right that like the tense structure is like very different in Chinese versus English. Another example of this, and not related to money, is in English there's a very clear kind of word for, oh, this is true versus this is not true. And then in Mandarin, it's just this is reality versus this is not reality. Like that, there's no direct translation of the word truth, which is really fascinating. And I think language really shapes our views on the world, right?
And I think that's a big thing that a lot of people, myself included, didn't realize until I went to a completely different culture. And I was like, oh, things are different on all angles here, all fronts. So yeah, that's really interesting to hear your perspective about Mandarin as well. I'll try to find that video and send it to you. It might be lost on the internet somewhere. It was really interesting. So we're on the topic of money now. On a personal note, what does planning, saving money, you're living in Mexico, I'm assuming not a citizen of Mexico, you are traveling around the world. Like, what does that look like for you in terms of saving, even spending, investing?
Totally. So for my wife and I think the way that we have talked about kind of our planning is we, first of all, we're a household, so we kind of combine our finances. I think that's something that a lot of couples on the road have to figure out, like if they want to do that, if they don't want to do that. For us, we have a kind of process set up where we take a look at what is our rough kind of distribution of income coming in, let's say on a monthly basis. And we apply those percentages to our joint expenditures on the expenses side. So we say, okay, typically we have, certain fixed expenses every month. We have our rent. We have things like food that we're paying for, groceries. All right, that's all part of this fixed expense bucket. And we sum up like what would be the monthly amount for that fixed spend. And then we also add in our savings goals. So we say, okay, there's certain things that we want to save for every month. So my wife and I are, still interested in having a honeymoon, so saving for that, and then having some business kind of projects together. Okay, saving for that. So that together would be kind of like the rough monthly number of quote unquote like spend, and we apply that percentage of our income distributions to those expenses and savings, which is which if you calculate out the math, it turns out to be the amount that we would then transfer, like after we receive our paychecks or business income or whatever it is, that's the amount that we would then transfer over to the joint accounts for checking, and then later we can then split that up amongst like the savings goals.
Are you looking to become a diversified global citizen? If this is a lifestyle that you're seeking to create, we can help. Whether it be multiple residencies, citizenships, bank accounts, trusts, or company formations, we operate in 30 plus of the most tax-friendly jurisdictions around the globe to get you structured properly. Head to the link in the show notes to learn more and to get your global citizen journey underway today. I'm always so curious how other global citizens plan their finances, because there's so many tools. If you are specifically, quite honestly, in the US, they have all the good things. Being from Canada and growing up there, it's like, oh, like they have everything that I want, and the prices are so much better, and it's just totally across the border. But like Copilot is a really interesting tool that always really intrigued me. And there's a lot of competitors to financial planning softwares like that, but it's tricky, I find, being nomadic, because I have, and especially living a very global citizen life, like I have bank accounts in 10 plus countries around the globe. I have different residencies, and I'm living in different countries and investing in different countries. And there's no one simple tool to plan everything out, because you're in different markets around the globe. You're not only in the American market with all of your capital invested there. So I think it is very much so to each their own and what works best for you. But it definitely took me a little bit of thinking to figure out, what's the best system that works for me.
The different tools in Asia, the tools in the US when it comes to personal finance are, far ahead in the market, just so much easier, or, lower fees, or all these different aspects of what makes a financial technology or a product good is generally more of the case in the States rather than other parts of the world. And I know this as well because my wife is Australian, so she also has her accounts in Australia. And then while we were in Singapore, we had our bank account in Singapore, and we actually opened up a joint bank account in Singapore while we were living there to then start executing that process that I mentioned earlier. And later, I've actually had a hard time finding an alternative to use, because if my wife tried to open up a bank account in the U.S., it's a lot more complicated because you need an ITIN or a social security number. And then my wife, doesn't really want to do that right now. So that's not that easy to proceed. There are interesting kind of alternatives, in the U.S. market. Like sometimes you get a fintech app that you can then add users onto the app itself, just for managing the accounts. So legally, you might still be, the owner of the account, so it's not technically a joint account, but then maybe your wife or spouse or, someone else in your family can become a user of that account and still manage funds.
I love this conversation because you and I, it sounds like with our partners, we have the same problems where they're both from different countries. Like my partner is from Mexico. And so it's not easy to just like live a normal financial life and have a joint checking and savings and like all of these things. It becomes exponentially more difficult. Yeah. So, we have some solutions figured out, but it's very individual based on the couple because it's like, where are you living? Where are you holding residencies? Yeah. There's a lot that goes into it. Yeah. So on the topic of money and finances, I need to ask you, what were some of the main lessons that you learned from earning over $100,000 from your side hustles that took only 2 hours per day?
So side hustles are something that can divide some people. So some people view it as a distraction to your main hustles. For example, there's been some mainstream articles that are like, oh, you don't have a side hustle. You gotta dedicate yourself to, being loyal to your employer, or, it's just a distraction from you increasing your compensation from your main hustle. But for me, side hustles has been a amazing way to not only diversify income, but it's a great way to also build skills that help you differentiate yourself too in the job market. So right now there's definitely a lot of turmoil in the US job market. From talking with friends in Singapore, it's still, relatively, challenging in that market as well. So across the world, I think people are trying to figure out ways of like, how do they differentiate themselves and how do they get ahead? And I think side hustles are a big part of that. So for me, where I started was I started in San Francisco, while I was working at Dropbox, experimenting with a variety of different side hustles. I started a tea e-commerce brand, and my a business partner and I, we launched a tea sampler box at the time, and then later also started doing private tea tasting events. And that was a fun experience. It didn't really make a whole lot at the time, but learned a ton from that experience. And then later, while I was out on the travel sabbatical, I started my career coaching service. And that was a career coaching service that was focused on tech professionals, either people transitioning into tech. For example, someone who had someone who was a head of data for a nonprofit, and then she wanted to break into tech. Or it was someone who was transitioning within tech, especially folks who had a more non-traditional background. So, for example, I had a mom who was out of the workforce, who then transitioned back into the workforce and joined a public tech company as a product manager. So these were some examples of the types of clients I worked with for this career coaching side hustle. And that was a fantastic experience for me to learn, skills like sales, right? And one of the key lessons I learned at that point in time was, when you're starting something new, it's better to start broad, but go narrower than you think afterwards. So for career coaching, my offers started really broad. I did things like anything from career discovery to negotiations, you name it. And I felt overwhelmed by doing that. And I think this is something that a lot of people who start side hustles end up in that position. Then I narrowed down to job search as a specific category. I got more clients by doing that, but that was still too general. Differentiation was still too hard. And after interviewing my existing clients, especially the ones who are happy and fulfilled by our engagements, then I discovered they all share this common trait, like making career transitions into the tech industry. So some observations were, people came from these non-traditional backgrounds. They were typically first or second generation immigrants. There were some insights that I got from talking with my clients. And then armed with those fresh insights, then I designed a much more niche kind of specific program designed to help clients specifically from that background, those career pivoters, win their tech dream job. So that was one important lesson for me of starting broad and then going narrower than you think. A second lesson that I'll mention quickly is that I also noticed, just from side hustles, but also looking at case studies of over 20 side hustlers, and that was from our interviewing from my team. We discovered that 50% of side hustlers tended to get their first client from referrals or their immediate network. And this was true for me as well. So after career coaching, I started another side hustle doing product consulting. And what I noticed with that was my first 4 clients were mainly from referrals from existing colleagues or, a friend who worked in venture capital or a direct network kind of connection. A founder friend expressed interest. So I discovered that most side hustlers that I've seen successful, out of that, about 50%, tended to get their first clients from their immediate network. And then that's what I've been encouraging people to really tap. But a lot of people don't feel comfortable with that initially because they're like, oh, like what are people going to think about my service, about the product that I'm trying to market? There's a whole another bucket of things around like psychology and fear, imposter syndrome that they have to work through for that.
I want to transition the conversation slightly and talk on a more personal lifestyle level and talk about, you're living in Mexico City right now. I'm actually in Mexico as well, but not for too much longer. And I want to hear a little bit more about your experience. You've lived in Asia, you've lived globally in various different countries. So what has the community that you've built, the network that you've built here in Mexico and Mexico City, what does that look like along with just everyday general life? And how does that compare, better or for worse? Be completely honest, please, compare to some of the other places that you've lived as well.
For context, I've lived in Singapore. We're in Mexico City now. And then previously I was in San Francisco. And I've spent time in a bunch of other cities as well. My wife and I spent, a few months in Saigon in Vietnam, and my wife's from Sydney, so we've spent a good amount of time there. I think one of the really unique parts about living in Mexico City is that it's a place where there's kind of like a international hub, if you will, for Latin America, and that's really cool. So what I enjoy is being able to meet people from all different parts of Latin America here. Also, of course, you got your Americans here, you got your Canadians, you also have some Europeans and even some Aussies. So it's a pretty dense kind of international hub, which is interesting. Being able to be surrounded by so many cultures. Two is, I really enjoy the food here. So my wife and I always love exploring things like street food, new cuisines, and Mexico City has a ton of, different food options to offer. Even when it comes to Asian food, it's like, 5 years ago when I came here, I didn't really find that many, but actually now we have a bunch of different options that we're pretty happy about. So Mexico City has really, I think, increase the amount of diversity of like cuisines and food options as well. The third thing is the accessibility for, at least the area around the expat hubs are pretty good for getting around by bicycle. And you can bike to the park, for example, on a Sunday. And one thing that's unique is, they'll close down all of Reforma, one of the neighborhoods in Mexico City on Sunday mornings, just for pedestrians and for cyclists. And that's a really cool experience. I think on the downside front, Mexico City is definitely, it's still affordable, but it is getting more expensive over time because there's an influx of expats, digital nomads, like remote workers like us. And two is it's definitely a very crowded kind of city. So there's 30 million people in Mexico City around, not within the city proper, but just around the entire area. And there's a lot of traffic. So if you want to go, from point A to point B in, a relatively moderate distance away, then it's going to take a while because you're going to be stuck in traffic for a while.
Yeah, I love Mexico City. I know off air we were talking about a little bit about Mexico, and Mexico City is easily my favorite city in the country. There's just so much to do, but there is a lot of people, and I think you really have to be in specific areas. And unfortunately, I think this goes without saying, but the prices are higher in those areas, but that's where
Totally.
a lot of the foreigners are, the expats. It's kind of where you want to be. The cafes that have good Wi-Fi, more reliable, good restaurants, like they all kind of go hand in hand as they do in many countries. But I'm curious, have you been able to find a good like-minded entrepreneurial network of others there in Mexico City?
Yeah, I think in Mexico City, as I mentioned, it attracts people from all over Latin America and from international as well. And what I've noticed is that at least within these like international pockets in Roma and Condesa, there are quite a number of people who are entrepreneurs, freelancers, people who are working on, their businesses. And another thing that is interesting to me is that Mexico City is kind of a tech hub. So there's a lot of also entrepreneurs who are starting tech companies as well, based out of Mexico City and serving either Mexico or Latin America. So that's pretty interesting. And that makes it easier than to find people who are like-minded, like you said, who are interested in the entrepreneurial journey versus like more of a corporate kind of mindset. Have I found that to be easier here than other places? I do think there's quite a lot of entrepreneurial kind of backgrounds, at least amongst the kind of foreigner group here. That's what I've noticed. And that feels higher to me than most American cities I've been in.
Interesting perspective. Okay, well, Dexter, thank you for being on the show. We talked about a lot of things. I love talking about money and finance for global citizens, digital nomads, and I'm sure a lot of people listening are very interested in Mexico and Mexico City specifically and what that looks like from a traveling nomadic perspective. Tell the listeners where they can find you and the business online.
Absolutely. So you can find me, you can find our website at www.moneyabroad.co, and you can find me on LinkedIn and on Twitter.
You've just listened to the Work, Wealth, and Travel podcast. If anything from this episode resonated with you, I'd appreciate if you share this podcast on your socials. And of course, be sure to tag us at Work, Wealth, and Travel. And don't forget to leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for joining us on this global citizen journey, and we'll see you in the next episode.